Greetings and salutations, everyone. My name is Andrew Kirchhoff, and welcome to my YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to be talking about my Week 17 running back rankings for the 2023 fantasy football season. First and foremost, if you're watching this, congratulations. You have made it to Week 17 championship week. Again, this entire marathon that we call the fantasy football season has taken a lot of effort, a lot of critical decision making, and you guys have done that and gotten here to the final week. So congratulations. But job's not done. So let's go ahead and let's finish out strong. Over the course of today's episode, we're covering all topics related to the running back position, beginning with matchups, talking about which defenses are allowing the most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs so that we can identify the most advantageous matchups going into Week 17. Of course, after that, I'll transition into talking about my top 36 running back rankings, sharing with you guys my thought process and opinions on each individual player, while also presenting statistics in order to justify these overall running back rankings. Before we get into today's content, a reminder, if you're looking for a specific running back, there are timestamps down in the description of the video. While you're down there, if you appreciate the content and of course the timestamps, be sure to click the like button and of course subscribe. We're making daily fantasy football content, hopefully for the remainder of the season, in order to capture you guys a 2023 fantasy football championship. Thank you very much. Okay, so let's talk about running backs in regards to matchups. As you guys can see to the right side of the screen, we have 2023 running back rushing stats allowed. This is throughout the spectrum of time between weeks 15 through 16, and it is basically isolating running back rushing yards and rushing touchdowns. So regardless of what scoring format you play in, whether it's a standard, half PPR, full PPR, we have an indication as to what's the most advantageous matchup in terms of rushing for these running backs. The Arizona Cardinals, Indianapolis Colts, Carolina Panthers, Seattle Seahawks, New York Giants have been at the top of this conversation for the last couple of weeks, giving up the most rushing statistics to opposing running backs in terms of fantasy points on a per game basis over the course of the last 11 games. Therefore, we want to take advantage of those overall matchups. There's a reason why DeAndre Swift, who takes on the Arizona Cardinals, is today's thumbnail, because he has an incredibly advantageous matchup against a team that is giving up a lot of yards, the most amongst all in terms of running back rushing yards over the course of the last 11 games. And of course, a lot of touchdowns and a yard per carry average that is extremely high. Nonetheless, we'll take advantage of that on the more difficult side of these overall matchups, because there are disadvantageous matchups going into this given week. We have teams like the Chicago Bears, the Miami Dolphins, the Atlanta Falcons, Houston Texans, teams that have not given up much in terms of yard per carry average to opposing running backs. I mean, the Texans are only allowing 2.77 yards per carry to opposing running backs in the last 11 games that they have played. That is a ridiculously low number. So we have to always take into account that some of these matchups are going to be, very difficult for our running backs, but hopefully their talent and their overall opportunities are going to be able to surpass that, because we're looking for success across the board. Nonetheless, I'll refer back to these statistics over the course of today's episode. Just wanted to go ahead and present them first and foremost so you guys have an indication as to what we're, kind of referring back to over the course of today's episode. Now, with that all covered, let's transition into talking about my top 36 running back rankings for Week 17. But before I do, remember, rankings are always subject to change. Between now and Sunday's games, there are going to be changes to these overall rankings. Players like Josh Jacobs, Isaiah Pacheco, I have no clue whether or not they're going to even play. So that could absolutely impact the overall rankings of guys like Clyde Edwards-Helaire, Zamir White. So keep that in mind. Bijan Robinson Jr. hasn't played the last 2 weeks. We have no clue. So for those of you trying to stay up to date on my latest rankings, you can, of course, subscribe, swing on by during the live streams this upcoming weekend, or you can go ahead, travel down to the description, and check out Underdog Fantasy. At this current moment in time, if you sign up using code Andrew, make that first-time deposit minimum of $10. Not only can you draft some teams, put together some pick-em slips, but you'll get the first-time deposit match up to $100, and you'll get my rankings for the next 2 weekends. Again, if in fact you do play into Week 18, that is, obviously up to your overall league. Hopefully you don't, but I'll be here either way supporting and giving you guys rankings. But for this upcoming weekend, if you guys need those rankings, be sure to go ahead, sign up today using code Andrew. Be sure to check out the map to the right side of the screen to determine your eligibility. If you sign up before Saturday's game between the Dallas Cowboys and Detroit Lions, you can take advantage of 0.5 total yards from Dak Prescott. Thank you very much. Okay, let's talk about running backs, beginning with the number one. Of course, it is Christian McCaffrey. Besides the fact that he's the number one running back in fantasy football, he has one of the more ridiculous matchups going into the given week. Let me just give you a perspective as to how well running backs have played up against the Washington Commanders as of late. I presented about 90% of these overall stats last week when we were talking about Breece Hall, but now we're going to add Breece Hall to this conversation because he's another running back that dominated in the matchup. Recent performances of running backs versus the Commanders. Breece Hall 37.1, Kyren Williams 22.0, Mostert 11.6, while Achane in the same game 23.8. Pollard, 19.3. Saquon, 28.0. Kenneth Walker III, 19.2. Ramondre Stevenson, 20.9. Swift with 13.4. And Barkley again in another contest, 17.3. Those are just the most recent performances against the Washington Commanders in a half PPR scoring format. So imagine what Christian McCaffrey, the best running back in fantasy football, is capable of accomplishing in that matchup. Our number 2 is Kyren Williams, who's coming off another incredible performance. This is 6 consecutive games in which he's been able to total over 100 yards. On top of it, he's been able to score 6 touchdowns in those last 6 games. Since week 5, the New York Giants are the 5th best matchup at the running back position in terms of rushing statistics allowed, 15.69 on a per game basis, allowing 4.68 yards per carry. This offense is dominating in all spectrums, whether it's on the ground and through the air, but it begins from the overall rushing efforts of Kyren Williams and how well this offensive line has blocked for him. So going into the matchup against the New York Giants, I assume, of course, the Los Angeles Rams will impose their will on the ground and allow Kyren Williams to have another 100-yard game with a touchdown. Moving on to our number 3, we have Rachaad White, another one of these running backs who is getting a high level of overall opportunity. 6 of the last 8 games that Rachaad White has played, he's been able to get himself 20 or more rushing attempts. That is a ridiculous number. This offseason, when we talked about running backs that we wanted on our teams, we talked about workhorse backs, players that were getting the ball and touching the ball 20 plus times per game. And in the most unlikely form, we found that in Rachaad White this season. And he dominated. Over the course of the last 8 games, where he's been averaging 18.21 fantasy points per game and a half PPR, he has scored 8 touchdowns. He dominates through the air. This last week, besides the fact that he had himself 20 rushing attempts, 7 targets, 6 receptions. What more could we ask for? Taking on the New Orleans Saints, should be able to have himself a great performance. On number 4, the thumbnail of today's episode, to close out the A tier, is DeAndre Swift. DeAndre Swift coming off a performance in which he had 20 carries. Fantastic. That's 2 weeks in a row now where he's gotten a high level of overall opportunity. 92 yards on the ground and 1 rushing touchdown. Finally, a week in which Jalen Hurts didn't steal every rushing touchdown, but going into this weekend's contest against the Arizona Cardinals, I think it's just a matter of, can DeAndre Swift make those big runs so that we're never even in the conversation of potentially having Jalen Hurts steal a touchdown, which I think is very possible, especially considering how terrible the Arizona Cardinals have been. In terms of stopping the run, they are the worst team. They've allowed the most fantasy points per game to opposing running backs since week 5, 18.52, just off rushing statistics isolated. That's rushing yards and rushing touchdowns. They're allowing a 4.71 yard per carry average. And most recently, we have seen running backs like Khalil Herbert, 18.6 fantasy points, Christian McCaffrey, 39.2, Kyren Williams, 35.4, Devin Singletary, 18.8, and Bijan Robinson with 17.1. So why not DeAndre Swift going into this week in the most advantageous matchup, especially considering the momentum he's been building over the course of the last 2 games. Number 5 for this week is Travis Etienne. The primary reason why I have Travis Etienne in this position is because of 2 specific variables. Number 1, Trevor Lawrence doesn't seem like he's going to play going into this week, which should mean more running the ball, assuming, of course, CJ Beathard is going to be the starting quarterback of the Jacksonville Jaguars within this week. On top of that, they take on the Carolina Panthers. That's the 3rd best matchup at the position. They're allowing over 4 yards per carry, 16.88 fantasy points per game in terms of rushing statistics isolated, and we're just coming off a week in which, of course, Aaron Jones went for 127 rushing yards against them. A.J. Dillon was the one that stole the rushing touchdown, and also Jordan Love stole a rushing touchdown. So there could have been a lot of stats just isolated from the running back position there alone. I think Travis Etienne can step up to the task at hand in a very advantageous matchup and deliver a great performance. Number 6, we have Jahmyr Gibbs, someone who continues to put up great performances, especially as of late. Over the course of the last 3 games, he has scored 5 touchdowns. And regardless of overall game script, whether they're in a positive game script where they're leading, he's still getting himself a lot of rushing utilization. And whether they're in a negative game script in which, of course, they're down points, he's getting himself a lot of utilization through the air. He's coming off a performance in which he had 15 rushing attempts, 80 rushing yards, 2 rushing touchdowns. I mean, of course, makes defenders miss every single time he has the ball in his hands. But on top of it, 7 targets, 4 catches, 20 receiving yards. Whenever you're able to add the extra element, the dynamic nature of his receiving potential on top of his performance, all while, a guy like, David Montgomery is getting himself 19 touches each of the last 2 weeks within this offense, the Lions offense just can't be stopped. And Jahmyr Gibbs is a huge part of that. He's played extremely well as of late. I mean, over the course of the last 9 games, he scored 10 total touchdowns. He continues to put up great performances. And this week they take on the Dallas Cowboys. We have seen teams, as of late, find themselves a lot of success in the running game against that defense. If you run it between the tackles, which is, again, something that the Detroit Lions do extremely well amongst all teams. Of course, they like to run it off tackle a lot as well. But I believe it's safe to assume that Jahmyr Gibbs could have himself another top 10 running back performance going into the given week. Something that I wanted to mention, last week in the game, Jahmyr Gibbs, yes, he had 2 rushing touchdowns, but there was a point in that game in which he was tackled at the 1 yard line. And unfortunately, The next play was a 1-yard passing touchdown to Amon-Ra St. Brown. Could have had himself an even better performance last week. That's how great he has been as of late. Number 7, we have Jonathan Taylor. Jonathan Taylor last week was his first game back since his overall injury and the surgery that he had on his thumb. In this overall performance, 18 total touches on the ground, had himself a rushing touchdown. A solid overall play of 10.3 fantasy points against the Atlanta Falcons, which all things considered was one of the more difficult matchups going into the given week. I mean, the Atlanta Falcons, prior to getting scored on by Jonathan Taylor, had not allowed a rushing touchdown to an opposing running back all season long. Of course, we knew that Jonathan Taylor would be able to break that streak as he was able to accomplish it earlier in the season against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. And of course, even going into this matchup this week against the Las Vegas Raiders, who over the course of the season have typically given up their fair share of yards to opposing running backs, but as of late, they've played extremely well. Since the coaching change from weeks 9 through 16, this defense is only allowing 10.01 fantasy points per game in terms of rushing statistics isolated to opposing running backs. So it's not as enticing of a matchup as it may seem going into the matchup since the coaching change. But nonetheless, we're talking about a running back who's gotten himself 18 plus touches in 3 of the last 4 games and has scored 1 touchdown in each of those last 4 games. The expectation is a solid overall performance here, especially with Michael Pittman Jr. back. It expands the offense even more, makes them far more relevant. I expect Jonathan Taylor to have himself a solid week. Our number 8 is James Cook, who's coming off a very underwhelming performance, but the numbers that I really want to look at besides the yardage, besides his overall fantasy points, is his overall touches, because that is really what matters. 20 rushing attempts, especially in a week in which they elevated Leonard Fournette from the practice squad. That speaks volumes to their trust with James Cook. Even once he fumbled in that game, they continue to give him carries. In 4 of the last 5 games, James Cook has had 20 or more touches. All we can ask for is opportunity, and eventually his efficiency and how well this offensive line has played as of late will be able to elevate James Cook to a fantasy relevant point. This week they do take on the New England Patriots, and I understand that teams have struggled against them as of late. Most recently, the last 5 teams in running back performances against the Patriots: 63 and a touchdown, 48 and 0, 40 and 0, 34 and 0, and 52 and 0. Not a lot of yardage, not very many touchdowns, and I know it's difficult, but the last time out, James Cook against his defense, 17.7 points. Don't let that get past you. I think this could be a contest in which James Cook gets back on track and back to being fantasy relevant. Number 9, we have Kenneth Walker to close out the B tier. Kenneth Walker, very similar to the conversation we just had with James Cook. It's all a matter of touches. And what we saw for a second consecutive week, weeks 15 and 16, is that Kenneth Walker is dominating the touches in this backfield. He has had 39 touches in comparison to Zach Charbonnet's 7 total touches. That's 24.8 fantasy points going in the direction of Kenneth Walker in a half PPR, compared to 1.7 fantasy points going in the direction of Zach Charbonnet in a half PPR. My expectation is that this offense has purely learned, hey, we have to go ahead and feed our best running back the ball, and they're beginning to do that at a far higher rate than which they proved earlier on in the season. Therefore, going into the matchup against the Pittsburgh Steelers, one that I find to be advantageous, especially considering, as of late, running backs versus the Steelers. Indianapolis, 28.5 fantasy points. New England, 25.7 fantasy points. Arizona, 24.5 fantasy points. I think this could be a week in which Kenneth Walker puts up a solid, massive performance for fantasy purposes. Moving on to our number 10, to begin the C tier, we have Saquon Barkley. I did not believe that Saquon Barkley could have himself a solid performance last week, especially considering the difficult nature of the matchup against the Philadelphia Eagles, but it seems like the Philadelphia Eagles just can't stop the run, and on top of it, the quarterback change really did help elevate the potential of Saquon Barkley within this offense. Now, in terms of overall yardage, a little bit different, but in terms of moving the ball and getting Saquon into a position to score, Tyrod Taylor in this offense, in comparison to Tommy DeVito, made a huge difference. And going forward, assuming that Tyrod Taylor is going to be the starting quarterback of this team against the Los Angeles Rams, should continue to give him more opportunities to score on a weekly basis. Therefore, even though I would typically be worried about the matchup against the LA Rams, considering running backs against the Rams as of late, Washington, 48, 0 tutties. Baltimore, 69, 0 tutties. Cleveland, 87, 0. Arizona, 61, 0. And New Orleans, most recently, 27 on the ground for 0 rushing touchdowns. That in itself, very worrisome, but we're going to hope that Tyrod Taylor can elevate this offense, and of course, the skill and the opportunities will lead him to fantasy success, because that's all we could ask for in championship week. Moving on to number 11, we have Bijan Robinson, who's coming off a performance in which, again, still not a lot of opportunity in terms of rushing attempts, only 12 in comparison to, Tyler Algier, who had himself 9 rushing attempts. Again, the distribution there is not great, and it's not, heavily favored in the direction of Bijan Robinson like we'd like it to be, but he did get himself a surprising 10 targets in the quarterback chain going from Ritter to Heineke. And if in fact that number can continue to stay consistent, that'll be fantastic. 10 targets, 7 catches, 50 receiving yards. I mean, that's a lot of fantasy points that we're getting out of absolutely nowhere. And even though Tyler Algier scored a rushing touchdown, stole a lot of rushing opportunities, and was highly efficient, and we should probably expect to continue to see him, going into this week, this is quite literally the toughest matchup at the running back position in terms of running the ball. They're only allowing 7.07 fantasy points per game on the ground and 3.44 yards per attempt. So I assume that the Falcons will have themselves struggles in terms of running the ball this week, but hopefully if the targets continue to maintain consistent from Taylor Heineke going in the direction of Bijan Robinson, he should continue to maintain his fantasy relevancy. Moving on to our number 12 to close out the RB1 conversation, we have Raheem Mostert. Raheem Mostert is dealing with a shin injury. If in fact we're going to be in a situation in which he misses, of course, Devon Achane and Jeff Wilson Jr., they jump in the overall ranking of the conversation. But when we're talking about the running back that currently has 21 total touchdowns this season, continues to score every single week, and I understand that this week they take on the Baltimore Ravens, and the Baltimore Ravens just tore apart Kyle Shanahan's offense, and it'll be very easy to transition going from Shanahan's offense to McDaniel's offense, considering, again, that's one of his proteges. I understand that all of the narratives potentially lean in the idea that the Miami Dolphins may get beat up, especially with Tua dealing with an injury and Waddle potentially missing this week. There is a lot of things that are stacked up against this team. Hopefully they can be healthy, and hopefully they can put up a solid performance here. I would assume that Raheem Mostert at very least finds himself in the end zone if he's active, healthy, and ready to go. Moving on to our number 13, we have James Conner. This may be a surprise, but what James Conner has done over the course of the last 3 weeks, I can't stop ignoring. This man cannot be stopped. He has literally put up the last 3 fantasy performances in a half PPR, 22.5, 16.4, and 19.7. Most recently this last week against Chicago, in which he had himself, only 45 rushing yards, but 5 catches, 67 through the air, and a receiving touchdown on 60% of the offensive snaps. Over the course of the last 4 games, running backs have been able to take advantage of the Philadelphia Eagles. Saquon with 17.9, Kenneth Walker with 18.7, the Dallas Cowboys running back duo combined for 24.8, and Christian McCaffrey with 20.8. The assumption would be that the Arizona Cardinals run the ball on the Philadelphia Eagles, as every team over the course of the last month has found themselves a lot of success doing so. So why not James Conner within the given week? Number 14, we have Alvin Kamara, who's coming off of quite literally his worst rushing performance of the season, and now has to take on a pretty, tough run-stop defense in the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Now, even though Alvin Kamara, in all circumstances, is typically matchup and, game script proof, considering, of course, he has so much receiving upside. So regardless of whether it's a positive or negative game script, he's going to touch the ball, but his overall efficiency is always going to be the question. Can he do a lot with his overall touches? Even though he had 14 total touches last week, he literally only had 35 total yards. That is not going to cut it for fantasy purposes, and many of us felt it. If in fact you still manage to survive and get to the fantasy championship with Alvin Kamara, congratulations, but I have him a little bit lower ranked because the matchup stuff, the offense hasn't played well in terms of running the ball as of late, and we have to hope that he falls into the end zone. Otherwise, we're going to have ourselves a tough week with Alvin Kamara. Moving on to our number 15. Man, Breece Hall was unbelievable taking on the Washington Commanders. I mean, we knew that running backs had dominated against that team, and we mentioned it last week, but I'll be totally honest. I was thinking, okay, yeah, sure. Breece Hall, if he finds the end zone, could be an 18-point player within the given week. Not 37 points. 37.1 is a ridiculous number because not only did he get himself his most rushing attempt since week 5, 20 carries, 95, 2 rushing touchdowns. I mean, ridiculous numbers. He also had himself 16 targets and 12 receptions. That's the second most receptions by a running back this season, only behind Alvin Kamara, who we just most recently spoke about. But the volume of opportunity that he was given, 32 touches. If we can get anything even close to that on Thursday against the Cleveland Browns, then of course, he's a must-start in the overall contest, especially if, in fact, those targets continue to go in his direction. That is the most valuable touches that he gets. I don't care what he does on the ground. If he can get himself another game in which he's catching the ball 7, 8, 10 times, by all means, he'll be far better than number 15. But I don't know how consistently Trevor Siemian is going to continue to look in his direction. Hopefully he does on Thursday against the Cleveland Browns. On number 16, speaking of catching the ball out of the backfield a lot, we have Ezekiel Elliott, who's coming off a performance in which he had himself 9 catches on 11 targets. If you guys remember on Sunday, Many of you guys were asking me, hey, Ezekiel Elliott, why is he so low in the rankings in terms of a half PPR? I said in a full PPR, it's definitely going to change and he goes up in the overall rankings. But in order for him in a half PPR to be relevant, he's got to catch the ball 6-7 times and he's got to find himself in the end zone. And he did it. Even though he had himself 27 rushing yards on 12 carries, he had himself 11 targets, 9 catches, 33 and a touchdown for 16.5 fantasy points on 83% of the overall offensive snaps. This week they take on the Buffalo Bills. Last time out, the New England Patriots beat the Buffalo Bills. And in that game, Ramondre Stevenson, Ezekiel Elliott, they combined for 20 carries for 65 rushing yards and a rushing touchdown, 7 targets, 6 catches, 51 through the air. There's a lot of potential here for Ezekiel Elliott to have himself another great performance for fantasy purposes. Our number 17 is David Montgomery. David Montgomery, 19 plus touches in 3 of the last 4 games he has played. Finally found himself in the end zone once again, scoring a rushing touchdown. And even though 13.9 fantasy points isn't a world beater, it's going to get the job done as an RB2 on a consistent basis. And the fact of the matter is, going up against the Dallas Cowboys this week, a team that struggles with smash mouth football, and we're talking about the Detroit Lions, who are a run-first smash mouth team, my expectation is that the Detroit Lions run the ball and find themselves a lot of success. And if they continue to give David Montgomery the ball 19 plus times, again, that's 3 of the last 4 games. If they continue to give him the ball at that rate, he's going to once again find himself in the end zone and become another solid RB2 play within the given week. On number 18, we have Devin Singletary, who takes on the Tennessee Titans. Back in week 15 against the Tennessee Titans, without CJ Stroud as the starting quarterback and without Nico Collins in the lineup, he had himself 26 rushing attempts for 121, 5 targets, 4 catches, 49 receiving yards, and 19.0 half PPR fantasy points. This week, again, with CJ Stroud back, Nico Collins back, we're in a position in which, of course, we should find a lot of success. Now, I understand last week, the Houston Texans offense struggled. When you have Davis Mills out there, you're going to struggle. But with the main quarterback back, with Nico Collins, of course, he did participate last week, but it was a difficult matchup against Cleveland secondary. I do expect this entire offense to elevate, but of course, I do expect them to go back to running the ball, as that's where they found a lot of success last time out against the Tennessee Titans just 2 weeks back. Moving on to our number 19, we have Tony Pollard. I would love to guarantee that Tony Pollard can find himself in the end zone. I mean, there were multiple occasions in which he should have scored a touchdown last week. There was an opportunity in which they were on the 1-yard line. They called a play action pass. Dak gets sacked for minus 11 yards. There's a play in which they hand him off the ball inside the 5-yard line. Instead of just dipping his head down and just running through the defender, he gets lifted and dropped right on the 1-yard line, doesn't score a touchdown. There were multiple opportunities there. 2 different drives. But nonetheless, we're in a position now that Tony Pollard takes on the Detroit Lions. Not the easiest matchup. Again, most recently, these are the performances that running backs have had against the Detroit Lions. Minnesota, 16 yards and a touchdown. Denver, 66, 0 touchdowns. Chicago, 64, 0 touchdown. New Orleans, 61 and 2. Green Bay, 54 and 0. As of late, teams have typically not played well in terms of running the ball against this defense. Therefore, Tony Pollard, if in fact they find any sort of struggle running the ball, isn't able to find the end zone. I mean, if he finds the end zone, sure, top 15 play easily. But if he's not in the end zone, Tony Pollard, not the safest overall play, as we have obviously, seen over the course of the last month now. Moving on to our number 20, we have Derrick Henry. I would love to assume that Derrick Henry, in his final couple games as a Tennessee Titans, is going to be given all of the opportunities. He's going to be given 20 touches again. I mean, this is a guy that literally, in 4 of the last 5 games, has scored 2 or more touchdowns. 4 of the last 5 games. The only game in which he didn't, score a touchdown is a game in which he set a record for the worst performance by a running back in NFL history. The first player in NFL history to have 20 touches in less than 15 total yards against the Houston Texans back in week 15. So we're going to hope there's going to be a revenge game on the horizon here for Derrick Henry, and that he can fall into the end zone and have himself a great overall performance. But again, the Houston Texans showed him a lot of trouble, and if the Tennessee Titans offense cannot fix their problems, again, our fantasy teams are going to find a lot of problems with Derrick Henry this upcoming weekend. On number 21, we have Austin Ekeler. I mean, the Chargers looked completely different on Saturday night, didn't they? Against the Buffalo Bills of all teams. My goodness, what a coaching change could, potentially make in terms of the difference of fantasy success. Austin Ekeler, back to 18 carries, was far more efficient in terms of running the ball, got himself a little sprinkle of utilization through the air, 10.1 fantasy points. We'll take it. Honestly, we'll take it. At this current juncture, we'll take it. Going into this week's matchup, they take on the Denver Broncos. It should be an advantageous matchup, mainly because they give up a lot of yards per carry, and they've given up their fair share of stats to opposing running backs as of late. Not only that, I mean, Ezekiel Elliott's coming off a week in which he had 16.5 fantasy points. You know, how he was able to accomplish it, 9 catches on 11 targets, very different. But I think Austin Ekeler is just as capable of having himself a solid performance against this Denver Broncos defense. Number 22, we have Clyde Edwards-Helaire. If, in fact, Isaiah Pacheco is active, he would be not significantly, but he'd be higher ranked for sure. Probably into the top 12 conversation, maybe ahead of Mostert. But at this current juncture, under the assumption that we do not have Isaiah Pacheco and, of course, Jerick McKinnon in the lineup, Clyde Edwards-Helaire taking on a defense in the Cincinnati Bengals, which is the 11th best matchup, allowing 14.15 fantasy points per game and 4.3 yards per carry on average since week 5, should be a solid overall week. I mean, the last 3 games that we have seen the Chiefs play, they've given their running backs 20, 24, and 22 running back touches. So if the Chiefs give CEH that level of opportunity, I would assume he'd find himself a lot of fantasy success within the given week in the advantageous matchup. 23, we have, speaking of the Cincinnati Bengals, Joe Mixon. He takes on the Chiefs. As of late, the Chiefs from weeks 9 through 16 against opposing running backs have given up 22, 20, 22, 12.6, 29.2, 15.6, and 18.2 fantasy points to opposing running backs on these other teams. Those are the combinations, okay? That is a lot of fantasy points to opposing running backs. But we have to hope, somehow, someway, Mixon isn't going to get dug into in terms of his overall workload by the potential of Chase Brown. Now, when I look at the overall snaps as of late, Chase Brown 56 overall snaps, Mixon 177. So we look like we're going to be in a fantastic position. I honestly think that Joe Mixon might need to be ranked a little bit higher. But what they put up last week in terms of performance against the Pittsburgh Steelers, quite scary. It could be just a matter that the Pittsburgh Steelers, because of their familiarity, they're obviously playing each other twice a year, the division rivalry, it gives them a slight advantage, and we may end up seeing Mixon and the Cincinnati Bengals offense be far more relevant within the given week. Wouldn't surprise me, but I am a little bit worried as to what they put forth last week, and that's why I currently have him here. Otherwise, it's a fantastic matchup against a defense that cannot stop opposing running backs. Now, one of those performances that we just mentioned in regards to the Chiefs not being able to stop a running back was Zamir White, who is today's number 24. Under the assumption that Josh Jacobs does not play this week, which he did not practice earlier today, which is another sign in which maybe Josh Jacobs is going to be inactive, we may have an opportunity in which Zamir White, a fantasy superstar, someone who saves our fantasy season in the fantasy football playoffs, puts up another great double-digit performance. I mean, he's coming off a week in which he had 14.5 fantasy points, all of his stats on the ground, 22 carries for $145, an offense that quite literally didn't complete a pass after the first quarter, leaned upon Zamir White, and of course he carried them to the promised land. Hopefully he can do that to our fantasy teams, taking on the second best matchup at the position, taking on the Indianapolis Colts, allowing 4.4 yards per carry and 17.4 fantasy points per game in terms of rushing statistics isolated. Moving on to number 25, we have Javonte Williams. Now that they have benched Russell Wilson, I don't know what to expect from this offense. I don't think Russell Wilson was playing badly, but now that you're going from Russell Wilson to Jarrett Stidham, I remember seeing this last year with the Raiders. Jarrett Stidham took over for Derek Carr, and even in that game, Jarrett Stidham came in against the San Francisco 49ers, put up a great performance. This time around, he'll be taking on the Los Angeles Chargers. A couple weeks back, Javonte Williams in the matchup against the Los Angeles Chargers in week 14, 17 carries, 66 on the ground, 1 rushing touchdown, 3 receptions, 25 through the air, 16.6 fantasy points. We could very easily see another big performance here from Javonte Williams. I just don't know if we're going to find a lot of success now that we've transitioned from one quarterback to the other. It could be seamless, but time will tell in this current circumstance. Moving on to our number 26, we have Ty Chandler. I would like to hope that the matchup itself is good enough for Ty Chandler to find success. It's the 8th best at the position, but the fact that this offense ran the ball quite literally only 8 times in comparison to the 36 passing attempts is quite alarming. I understand that Kevin O'Connell, the head coach and primary play caller of this team, wants to pass the ball a bunch. But if Nick Mullins is going to continue to throw interceptions, I would hope that they might want to go ahead and just run the ball a little bit more. I understand against the Detroit Lions is difficult, but going into this week's matchup against the Green Bay Packers, anybody can run the ball on them, especially the Minnesota Vikings. You go back to week 8, in which they took on the Green Bay Packers. In that game, Minnesota Vikings running backs, I think it was a combination of Alexander Mattison and Cam Akers. They combined for 12.8 fantasy points. Let's hope for something like that for Ty Chandler this week. Number 27, speaking of the Green Bay Packers, we have Aaron Jones. In the last 2 weeks, since coming back from his injury, he's been able to get himself 17-plus touches in both those games. The issue that I have with Aaron Jones is that they don't trust him as a goal line back. In both scenarios in Sunday's game, in which he had an opportunity to potentially score a touchdown, one play, here comes A.J. Dillon, steals a 1-yard rushing touchdown. The other, here comes a quarterback sneak in which, of course, Jordan Love finds himself in the end zone. If, in fact, we're not going to give him the most valuable carry in all of fantasy football, the goal line touch, then, of course, his overall potential for upside is limited, on top of the fact that they take on the Minnesota Vikings defense, which is a great defense as a whole, especially in terms of run stopping over the course of this season. On number 28 is Jaylen Warren. Under the assumption that this is going to be a game in which, of course, it's competitive, or potentially they're in a negative game script, Jaylen Warren should be a fantastic play. Since week 9, the Seattle Seahawks against opposing running backs. Let me just go ahead and read you the fantasy point totals of these backfields in these individual games. 30.08, which was most recently the Tennessee Titans backfield. Then 10.6, 24.9, 18.5, 32.5, 18.2, 38.7, and 37.1. They have given over 30 plus fantasy points to a backfield in 4 of the last 8 games that they have played as a defense. Again, this is one of the top 5 matchups at the position in terms of fantasy points allowed to opposing running backs. And Jaylen Warren, each of the last 2 weeks, he has outsnapped Najee Harris. Should be in a solid position to succeed in an advantageous matchup. Number 29, we have Jerome Ford. Outside of the last couple performances from Jerome Ford, even though he found himself scoring a touchdown this last week, outside of the last 2 performances, has been, a pretty consistent option for fantasy purposes. Now, I understand that he hasn't found much success on the ground, but it had to do a lot with the fact that they took on the Chicago Bears. Now they take on the New York Jets. The Jets are allowing 15.21 fantasy points per game to opposing running backs. And it's not only mainly due to game script, but the fact that the secondary for the New York Jets has played as well as they have. So, again, when you have a defense and a secondary that people are afraid of, they don't want to pass the ball against you. In a majority of scenarios, they're leading against you, so they obviously are going to run the ball regardless. It continues to accumulate stats there. My assumption would be that if, in fact, the Cleveland Browns continue to play as well as they have as of late, they'll take an early lead and they'll run the ball, and they'll find a lot of success doing so, considering the Jets cannot stop the run this season. Jerome Ford should find himself a lot of success, especially with Kareem Hunt dealing with a groin injury on a short week Thursday night game. Number 30, we have Chuba Hubbard. I honestly don't feel right about putting Chuba Hubbard here, especially considering the volume of opportunity he has had as of late. I mean, he's coming off another week in which he's had, 17 plus touches in the last 5 consecutive games. He's had himself over 10 fantasy points in the last 5 consecutive games on top of that as well. But each of the last 3 have pretty much been like 10 or 11 points. He's pretty much getting enough yardage, falling into the end zone, and is a solid play in that overall circumstance. And amongst all teams in the National Football League, this is a run-first team. They are literally running the ball about 50% of the time in the last 3 games that they have participated in, but they have to take on the Jacksonville Jaguars. It is one of the toughest matchups at the position, and they're going up against a defense that is only allowing 3.6 yards per carry, which is the 6th lowest amongst all teams in the National Football League. Not an easy matchup, which makes me a little bit worried about the overall scenario. Moving on to our number 31, we have Gus Edwards. Gus Edwards, since we have seen the injury to Keaton Mitchell in the last 2 games, Gus Edwards has scored a touchdown in both those contests. He's been a 13-point player in each of the last 2 games. If he can fall into the end zone against the Miami Dolphins, then he's absolutely going to be a top 24 back within the given week. But the question is, can he score against the Miami Dolphins defense, which is quite literally the second toughest matchup at the position, a defense that is only allowing 8.5 fantasy points per game, 3.45 yards per carry on average. It is not an easy task on hand. But if, in fact, the Miami Dolphins offense is injured, battered, they're going to be in a bad position going into the weekend, I may increase the overall ranking of Gus Edwards because this could be a one-sided affair throughout this given game. Moving on to our number 32, we have Najee Harris. So a couple stats that I wanted to mention. Besides the fact that the Seahawks have given up 30, 10.6, 24.9, 18.5, 32.5, 18.2, 38.7, 37.1. Those are the fantasy point totals of the backfields that they have played in the last 8 games. That's a lot of fantasy points. Besides those overall performances, in games in which the Pittsburgh Steelers have won this season, Najee Harris is averaging 11.44 fantasy points per game, while in games in which they've lost, averaging 6.21 fantasy points per game. 5 touchdowns in the games in which they have won, 0 in the games in which they've lost. If we're going to be in a scenario in which, of course, Najee Harris is going to be on the losing side of this overall game, may not be the prettiest overall play within the given week. Number 33, we have Devon Achane. I would only trust playing him if, in fact, we're going to have Raheem Mostert missing time. Outside of that, we've heard Mike McDaniel say over the course of the last couple weeks that he's still dealing with a little bit of an injury, still limited at practice. We're going to eventually get him to being at a full workload in the next couple weeks. I'm not 100% certain if we're there just yet. But at this current circumstance, as long as Raheem Mostert is active, Achane really is not being given enough opportunity, especially near the goal line, to be fantasy relevant in comparison to where we've had him ranked over the course of the last couple games. Our number 34 is Khalil Herbert, one of these waiver wire pickups in which you could make. They do take on the Falcons as the third toughest matchup, which is very scary, and this is 100% contingent on the idea that Deontay Foreman has to be inactive, and you never know, there may be still an opportunity for Roschon Johnson to steal a touchdown and make Khalil Herbert's day a living nightmare. Our number 35 is Antonio Gibson, again with Christian Rodriguez Jr. dealing with a little bit of an injury with his foot, and of course, Brian Robinson Jr. dealing with his hamstring injury. Maybe we're in a position in which Antonio Gibson is the only running back fired up within the given week against the 49ers, which could mean a lot of receiving in the overall game. The final option I wanted to mention is Tyjae Spears. They take on the Houston Texans. If, in fact, Derrick Henry runs into the wall and isn't able to gain yardage against the Houston Texans, I'm assuming they'd go ahead and pivot to potentially using a lot more Tyjae Spears within the given week, getting himself a lot of utilization within the receiving game. All right, that's going to cover it for me in regards to Week 17 running back rankings. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Greatly appreciate all the support. We'll be back tomorrow with wide receiver rankings prior to the Thursday night football game. Until next time, be sure to click the like button, subscribe. Thank you, everybody, for watching, and I'll see you. Peace.